I'm an adult who loves video games. I own a functioning Atari 2600 and have a box of old cartridges that all still work. A couple of times a year, we hook it up to our LCD TV and 5.1 surround sound system and bask in its lo-fi glory and gaze in wonder at its joystick with a single orange button. The good games were simple, elegant, and fun to play immediately. Between thrift store hardware finds and console emulators, I'm sharing the legacy of fun from this art form with my kids now. And I know many developers feel exactly the same way that I do. Honestly, back in the first heyday of video gaming, things were great. Online gaming hadn't been created yet, so you had to get together with your friends to play in person. Loads of companies were looking for ways to get into this market, so there was a steady stream of new hardware. Some of the devices were amazing, but for every amazing device, there were 5 really weird or terrible devices. Software licensing deals led to huge amounts of games, and you could amass boxes and boxes of game cartridges. Big game releases were huge events, and developers would stage huge release parties, and people would camp out in the streets for midnight releases. Gaming was huge, but it was dominated by a few major players. These companies worked very hard not only to hype up their games and the media events that surrounded them, but they also worked hard to keep competition and new companies out of the picture so that they could maintain the status quo. Game pre-sales came from this period as well. Pre-sales were an easy way to get money for a game before anybody knew if it was any good or not. Pre-sales also fit nicely into game marketing, as it created one more thing for companies to hype prior to the game's actual release. Microsoft was also a huge force in both computing and gaming. Valve founders Gabe Newell and Mike Harrington met when they were both working on the Windows operating system. Their time with Microsoft helped them learn both the processes and business sense they would need for game development. It also led them to believe that gaming was the future. After their time with Microsoft made them both millionaires, they decided to quit their jobs and take their fortunes to try their hand at independent game development. It was August of 1996. Michael Labrash, another Microsoft employee, helped Valve to get a license to use id Software's Quake engine to build their first game. Sierra Online agreed to distribute the game. After 2 years of development, Half-Life was released on November 8, 1998. Half-Life had smart and smooth gameplay. It also lacked cinematic cutscenes, so the player could experience everything and learn of the story entirely through the eyes of Gordon Freeman. The crowbar had quickly become an icon. After the initial success of Half-Life, Valve decided that they would try to get as much profit out of its code base as possible, and hired Gearbox Software, the same team that created the Borderlands series of games, to work on expansions of the original game. The first expansion, Opposing Force, allowed players to experience the game as a continuous, unbroken narrative free from cutscenes through the eyes of one of the enemy Marines. Blue Shift released 2 years later and worked on the same premise. It was also an unbroken narrative that allowed players to experience the disaster at Black Mesa again, but this time it was through the eyes of security guard Barney Calhoun. For 6 years, Valve continued to capitalize on the successes of the original Half-Life. Valve were quick to realize the value of game mods as a source of new ideas and creative gaming properties. They also recognized that the most successful mods already had devoted communities and strong code to work with. For the modders, their work was a labor of love. For Valve, their work was an opportunity. While working on the Half-Life expansions, Valve acquired Australian company TF Software Pty so they could gain control of the Team Fortress game mod for Quake. Valve reimagined Team Fortress inside of the Half-Life world and released their variant, Team Fortress Classic. Their real plan for this property was a sequel to Team Fortress, but that game wouldn't release for another 8 years. This was one of the first real instances of what is now referred to as Valve time, meaning that Valve will work on and release games whenever they are ready, and not one day sooner. Valve's successes with reimaginations of existing intellectual property led them to embrace remix culture even further, and they released the Half-Life software development kit to the public. It was a brilliant move for them. They were effectively fishing for talent and content, and unlike most other companies that would hide their code from the public to protect their proprietary intellectual property, Valve were using their code as bait. Between 2000 and 2003, three very different mods based on Half-Life's code released: a battle royale game, an arena combat game reminiscent of Tron, and a World War II combat game. The opening up of their code to the public continued to yield great successes for Valve, but there was one game coming that was going to be bigger than what anybody expected from a game mod. Counter-Strike and Counter-Strike Global Offensive were games that set players on opposing teams, terrorists perpetrating an attack and a counter-terrorist force trying to stop them. This variant on team-based capture-the-flag gameplay proved to be colossally popular and became an enduring title not only for regular online gaming, but also for the emerging esports community. Millions of dollars in prize money have been awarded for a game that was started as a fan remix. All of the work Valve have put into fostering openness and modding of games has reached maturity in the form of the Steam Workshop. The Steam Workshop allows game developers to get access to Valve's code, official guidance documentation, and it gives developers an outlet to monetize their creations if they choose to do so. Their openness have allowed for creation and innovation on a large scale. Well, I admit that it took a while, but the historical context was important to the rest of the material. Steam was originally conceived to be a simple distribution tool for Valve. It was initially met with a lot of resistance from gamers. It caused frequent game crashes, and many saw it as intrusive digital rights management. On top of that, it was only usable with Valve's games, and it was ugly. It wasn't until 2005, when Valve made third-party distribution deals, that it started to gain acceptance. Steam's summer and holiday sales eventually became events that were big enough to rival the old brick-and-mortar stores' game launch events. Minigames were eventually brought into the mix to get gamers to come back to Steam every day of a sale so they could earn discounts or even free games. By 2009, the Steam Cloud Backup Service plan was in place, as well as Steam community groups. Steam had become the easiest and most prominent way to get games. Physical media had effectively become a thing of the past, and pre-sales were rendered unnecessary, as there was no longer any way to run out of physical copies of new games. While Valve favored openness, most other companies preferred to control their intellectual property with an iron grip. Microsoft decided to move into the walled garden model for their Windows 8 operating system to match what had been so successful for Apple computers. This flew in the face of how Valve wanted to do business. They also saw it as a potential power and market grab. Gabe Newell understood what the Windows Store meant not only for his business, but for gaming as a whole, and decided to create something that would give Valve and gamers a way to beat the Windows Store and its potential control over the whole industry. Valve once again turned to open tools to create an alternative path from the Windows Store and created Steam for Linux. On February 14, 2013, the Steam client for Linux became available in the Ubuntu Software Center. There were only 50 titles available, but they were 50 to 75% off to try and stir up as much publicity as possible. The Steam client for Linux also included their new Big Picture mode, which was designed for use with a controller, a couch interface for Steam, taking gaming back into the living room. At a LinuxCon panel in 2013, Gabe Newell declared that Linux and open source were the future of gaming, and that there would be a Linux-related announcement soon. On September 23, 2013, Valve announced the creation of SteamOS, Valve's custom version of Debian Linux that was to be at the heart of Steam machines, consoles for the living room. Valve wouldn't be making the consoles, however. They were going to let hardware manufacturers do that for them. So there would be variants of Steam machines from different manufacturers with different specifications and price points. Not long after, Valve began accepting pre-orders for a Steam machine made by Alienware, as well as their Steam controller and the Steam Link game streaming device. This approach has ended up being a mixed bag for Valve. Steam machines are widely regarded to be a failure due to there being no clear version of the Steam machine, expensive price points, and wildly differing specifications available. Gamers were also disappointed that Steam machines were not able to play over half of the current library that they had on average. Many people think that the Steam Link streaming device was effectively the competition that killed Steam machines, because the $50 device allowed gamers to stream their games from their PCs to their living rooms without having to give up their Windows-only titles. Valve insists that Steam machines are not dead yet. The Steam Link has also been discontinued, but it has been kept alive as a mobile app, and in-home streaming is still available in the regular Steam client. The Steam controller is still going strong, winning over supporters a little bit at a time because it is infinitely configurable, which allows for keyboard and mouse games with no controller support to be played with the controller. The Civilization series of games are a perfect example of games that do not support controllers, but work very well with the Steam controller. It is also the first controller to approach the level of control offered by a keyboard and mouse in first-person shooter games. No business decision is without risk, and this one carried significant risk for Valve. So far, it looks like Valve's growth has not been affected negatively. The number of Steam users playing at any given time of day has trended steadily upward since 2012. The number of unique Steam accounts have also increased steadily. Of the current top 25 games on Steam, 14 of them have Linux versions. Since the launch of the Linux client, the number of Linux games has increased from 50 to well over 3,000. Still less than 1% of users in the Steam hardware survey use Steam for Linux. Some people attribute that to the success of the Steam Link. Still, Linux's market share had been slowly rising, and it absolutely crashed in the last 6 to 8 months. This was attributed to the sudden and unexpected influx of Chinese gamers to Steam. Nearly all Chinese Steam users do so on Windows, and a significant amount of the accounts are bot accounts. Oddly enough, though, the Chinese gamers play almost exclusively PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, and nobody really knows why. Valve time is still a real thing, though, and Newell's $4.1 billion value means that Valve can take their time and play the long game. The most important thing to occur yet happened just a few weeks ago. On August 21, 2018, Valve announced a new version of Steam Play. This version of Steam Play is powered by the Kronos Group's new graphics API, Vulkan. The Vulkan API works on Linux, Windows, Android, iOS, ties in the Nintendo Switch natively, and it works with macOS through third-party Molten VK for Metal. This allows developers to work with one API to target all of the operating systems and devices listed prior. Steam Play is so groundbreaking because it potentially solves the biggest issue that people had with Steam machines. It allows DirectX 10 and 11 games to be played on Linux at native or near-native performance levels. When the Steam Play beta was announced, only 27 games were officially supported, but that list included titles like Doom 2016, Nier Automata, and Tekken 7. There is unofficial support for another 3,000 Windows-only games. I can personally verify that the original Knights of the Old Republic, South Park: The Stick of Truth, BioShock Remastered, and Grand Theft Auto Vice City work flawlessly with no special configuration. If Microsoft wasn't worrying, now would probably be a pretty good time for them to start. And if all of this fails, Valve can still save themselves by finally releasing Half-Life 3. Thank you for watching.
Hello, and, again, welcome to the Aperture Science Computer-Aided Enrichment Center. Keep in mind that although fun and learning are the primary goals of all enrichment center activities, serious injuries may occur. For your own safety and the safety of others, please refrain from
Now I have a surprise for you. Deploying surprise in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
This was a triumph. I'm making a note here, huge success. It's hard to overstate my satisfaction. Aperture science. We do what we must because except the ones who I did. But there's no sense crying over every mistake. You just keep on trying till you run out of